Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sukkah daf Yud Chet. Today's daf is sponsored by Jessica Rabbanit on the occasion of her marriage to Harold Kinsberg today, and their joint siyum of Masechet Yomi they'll be doing at their wedding. Mazal Tov, and here's to being chavrutas for life. And by Michael Gordon in honor of his wife Abigail in their 15th wedding anniversary. Abigail, I'm so proud of everything that you do, and you're learning the daf Yomi on top of it all. And by Ronit Shavid in honor of her son drafting into the IDF, wishing him much success, may God protect him, and in memory of her mother, Leah Bat Masudi and Yaakov on her 16th yahrzeit. My mother was my inspiration to learn the daf. So Mazal Tov to everyone, and may our learning be L'iloi Nishmata as well. We're going to start now at the bottom of Yud Zayin Amud Bet. If you recall, what we learned yesterday was this issue of two different approaches to schach pasul, disqualified schach. Is it disqualified at 4 handbreadths, or is it disqualified at 4 cubits? Which is a very big difference. As we said, cubit is 6 handsbreadths to a cubit, so it's 6 times the size. We saw that Rav, according to the first version, thought that it's 4 handbreadths, and Rav, according to the second version, said 4 cubits. So now we're bringing sources. We're in the middle of a list of sources to raise questions on some of the approaches. So here comes our next question. Tashma, 3 lines from the bottom of Yud Zayin Amud Bet. Before we start, I want to just mention that as I'm recording in advance, so some of the materials that go up, the other resources on our site, I only mention after the fact. And the other thing in terms of my pre-recording over the next few weeks is that if you want dedications to go up, you're better off getting them to me earlier, maybe a few days earlier as I'm recording the dapim in advance. So try to get dedications in early for the next few weeks. So I want to mention last week, flashback, there was a flashback written by Shuli Mishkin all about Sukkah and what sukkahs were, what a sukkah is. It's not only associated in the Tanakh and in other places with the holiday of Sukkot. So there's a bit of a historical perspective on that, and different issues that come up about Sukkah. And Gefet, which is now in English, or our second Gefet in English, is all about this concept we saw with the cloth that changed based on poor people or rich people and different people using different things, and how halacha addresses issues that could be subjective. So it's a very fascinating topic. It's something that we talk about throughout our learning many, many times. Halacha has subjective attitudes towards things. So that's Gefet for this past week. Okay, moving on now to our topic. So Tashma, schacha b'nisarim shel erez. If you made schach with wooden beams, sheyesh behen arba'a, that have four handbreadths. Okay, so you took beams that are 4 handbreadths wide. Tivrei kol psula. Everyone agrees these are disqualified. Ein behen arba'a, if they don't have 4, remember this was all this machloket we saw before about this. If they aren't 4 wide, Rabbi Meir posel v'Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Then Rabbi Meir disqualifies, and Rabbi Yehuda says it's okay because it doesn't have 4 tvachim. Umode Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir admits though, she'im yesh ben neser leneser kimelo neser. If between each beam, there's each problematic beam, if they're less than 4, and then there's a space that is kimelo neser sheminiach psal, and if there's space that's equivalent to the size of the board, then miniach psal benehem ukshera. Sorry, this is when they are 4 tvachim wide. You have a 4 tvachim beam, space of 4 tvachim. So you fill it with kosher schach and kshera, and the sukkah is kshera. So now, who does this go according to? By the way, we learned this topic already, and we already explained it in a particular way, and we explained it based on the conclusion of this Gemara. But first, we're going to read it the way the Gemara originally assumes. The simple reading. If you really think that 4 handbreadths is a problem, then this should not help just because you fill it in with kosher schach in the middle. So therefore, they say this makes sense if you say that no matter what, the measurement is 4 cubits. And that's why each 4 tvachim beam is okay as long as there's 4 tvachim of kosher schach in between. But those who say that in the middle of your sukkah, a 4 tvachim beam disqualifies your entire sukkah, then why would this be okay just because you have kosher schach in between? Each beam is problematic in terms of the schach pasul. So Amar Rav Huna Bereit Rav Yoshua. So here now we come to this creative explanation of what this case is. I'll pull up the pictures. Here. Okay. So our picture, we're now on picture 111. It must be a sukkah that has only 8 tvachim exactly in the center with kosher schach. V'yahiv neser upsal v'neser upsal v'neser upsal mehai. And then on either side, we're going to have a 4 tvachim beam and then kosher schach. 4 tvachim beam, kosher schach, 4 tvachim beam. How much does that add up to? 4 times 5 is 20. 20 tvachim, that's less than 4 cubits. So we're going to have basically, and the way it's going to work is 4 tvachim beam, 4 tvachim schach, 4 tvachim beam, 4 tvachim schach, 4 tvachim beam. That gets you up to 20. 4 tvachim schach, okay, that gets you to the center of the sukkah. Then on the other side, it's going to be the exact same thing. So the 2 schachs that are next to the beams are going to meet in the middle. You're going to have 8 tvachim in the middle of kosher schach. That's the only kosher part of your sukkah. And both the sides are okay, even though they have these beams that are disqualified because of dofen akuma. Remember, that's our go-to, right? It's less than 4 cubits away from the wall, and therefore it's viewed as a continuation of the wall. And the whole sukkah is really only 8 tvachim wide, even though it's obviously a lot more. It's 40, it's 48 tvachim, okay? But in the end, only the kosher part is the 8 in the middle, and that's why it works. It has nothing to do with 4 cubits being a law of disqualified schach. It's the 4 cubits for dofen akuma, and that's why all these 4 tvachim beams that theoretically would be disqualified if they were in the middle aren't actually in the middle of your sukkah. Okay, next. And then here, I'll just keep reading, right? So then, yav neser upsal v'neser upsal v'neser upsal mehai. So you put, right, beam, kosher schach, beam, kosher schach, beam, kosher schach, from one side, v'neser upsal, v'neser upsal, v'neser upsal mehai gisa, right? And again, beam schach, beam schach, beam schach. The 2 schachs meet in the middle. The havalu shnei psalim be'emtza. That's what it means. The 2 schachs meet in the middle. V'ikach sher sukkah be'emtza. And then you have a kosher sukkah in the middle. Amar Abai, avir shlosha b'sukkah gedola. Comes Abai. This is picture number 112. If you have 3 tvachim of airspace in the middle of your sukkah, which clearly disqualifies it, and yet you fill it up, this is going to be interesting, umiyato bein bekanim, bein b'shipudim, whether you fill it up with kosher schach, which are the kanim, the reeds, or you fill it up with shipudim, these metal skewers, which are not kosher schach. However, by putting non-kosher schach there, you've narrowed the airspace. And remember, non-kosher schach is only a problem with 4 tvachim, and airspace is only a problem with 3 tvachim, and they don't mix. So now you have less space than you had before. So you now actually have less than 3 of space. And so even though you filled it up with non-kosher schach, lo havi miut. Okay, sorry, I read this wrong. Miato bein b'kanim bein b'shipudim havi miut. Okay, this works to make your sukkah smaller, make your space smaller, and make your sukkah kosher. But b'sukkah ktana, but if you have a small sukkah, okay, that's the next picture, 113, meaning your sukkah is exactly 7 by 7. Here we're going to say, b'kanim havi miut, if you put kosher schach in, it will make your hole smaller and will view the law of lavud as if it covers the whole space. But b'shipudin lo havi miut. But if you use shipudim, non-kosher schach, that's not going to help you because in the end, you don't have enough kosher schach here to cover your space of 7 by 7. Because in the end now, your kosher schach and your airspace and your non-kosher schach are taking up this space, which can't be counted as anything. And then you end up, you don't really have a wall of a minimum size. In the previous picture where we just basically say, well, you don't have airspace to mess up, but you have enough schach on that side and enough schach on that side, so it's okay. In this case, you don't actually have enough schach. So therefore, you need enough schach to cover your space, and you don't. If you had had less than 3 and it was just airspace and you didn't have non-kosher schach, you'd be able to say lavud. It's as if it covers the whole thing. But because you have this non-kosher schach here, you can't really use lavud in the same way and say that this is as if your schach covers the whole thing. This whole law of lavud works if it's on the side. Okay, so now we're going to say lavud, which basically, if assuming you had less than 3, let's say. So that would work if it's on the side of your sukkah. Lavud works to basically say it's as if your schach covers the whole rest. But the emtza, if you want to say, does lavud work in the middle of your sukkah? There's actually a Tannaitic debate about this. I'm sorry, debate of Amoraim about this. The plige bat Rav Acha veRavina. Chadamar yesh lavud be'emtza. So now we're on picture 114, where you have schach on one side and you have schach on the other, and you have this big gap in the middle, small gap actually. It's less than 3 tvachim of a gap. The question is, does lavud work to basically combine these two? Now, until now, we've been saying lavud works, but now we're going to see that there's actually a debate about whether it works in this case. One says, oh yeah, lavud works anywhere. It's any gap of 3. Remember, normally we talk about lavud in Shabbat. We talked about it when it was close to the ground. We can attach it to the ground. That's more like minatzad, to the end, right? Because you have a barrier there and then it, goes to there. The question is, does it work in the middle? Okay. Or is it just kind of on the edges? So my time, what's the reason for the person who says there is lavud in the middle? Now we're going to show that even by Shabbat and Eruvin, specifically Eruvin, when we're talking about an Eruv, we learn that there is lavud in the middle. How so? This is picture 115. Remember, for a mavoi, you have your 3 walls of your mavoi. You're basically having an alleyway that opens up into courtyards that open up into houses. And in order to allow this, what do? You put a beam through the top of the entrance to the mavoi. And that either provides you with some imaginary mechitzas if the mechitza goes down from there, or it's used as a heker, some noticeable way that you can see that you're going out into the public domain, and therefore you'll remember you won't go out. So that allows carrying inside. Again, that includes also food. What if you have a beam coming from one side of the entrance to the mavoi and a beam coming from the other, right? There was either you could put a lechi, which is standing up. We're not talking about that. Or you could put a cross beam going from one side of the entrance to the other. So if you have a korah yotza mikotel zeh, ve'ena nogat bekotel acher, but that beam doesn't make it all the way to the other side. So one is where, actually not this picture, where it goes all the way across, but doesn't actually reach the end, but there's less than 3 from the end. That's minatzad. The second case, one is coming from one side, one is coming from the other, and they don't touch each other. If it's less than 3, then you don't need to bring another beam. But once it's already 3, you have to bring a new beam. So here you see that it works from the middle. So what does the other opinion say? He says, Oshane korah de Rabbanan. Remember, we keep distinguishing. The whole law of mavoi is only a Rabbanan law, because really you can carry in a mavoi. We're just worried that maybe you'll end up carrying out to the public domain, and therefore we don't allow it. But it's only Rabbanan, meaning it's rabbinic in nature. When it comes to rabbinic issues, we can say lavud even in the middle. But when it comes to doraita, building a sukkah, then we're going to say you need it to be only on the side. Lavud works, it doesn't work in the middle. My time on demand, so who's the one yet? Well, the one who says there is no lavud in the middle? What's his source? Now we're going to talk about tuma. Here we have a skylight. Now, a skylight, you have to remember, skylights nowadays have windows on them, and they're closed. But in those days, a skylight meant that it was open. So you have this aruba shababayit. Uba poteach tefach. You have this skylight in your house, and it's a tefach by a tefach wide, tefach squared. So now 1 handbreadth square. That is open. So now we're going to have a few different cases. Tum'ah b'bayit, if you have tumah somewhere in the house, not opposite the window, what happens? Kulo tameh, the whole house is tameh because you have a roof. It's true there's this little opening, but we ignore the opening. You have this roof and everything in the house is tameh, except mashe keneged aruba tahor, exactly where. So let's say there's tumah on the side, and then you have this window. Underneath that window, it's open. It's not actually part of the house. It's almost viewed as, right, this is an open space. That if you have something like a vessel in this picture, there's a vessel at the bottom, that vessel would not be impure. Here you see on the couch, there's a dead body covered with a talit here. And then right where this, the spaces of this window, the skylight is actually pure because it has no roof. Tuma keneged aruba, what if the dead body is right underneath the window? Then the law is going to be different. Kulo tahol. Everything in the house is going to be tahol. Okay, because basically the tumah only goes up. So if there's something above the window, which there really can't be, right, it'll be tameh, but nothing else because it's not viewed as an oil since there's no window above it. There's no ceiling above it. Next case. Ein ba'aruba potech tefach. If it doesn't have a tefach, so now tumah b'bayit keneged aruba tahor, it's going to be really very similar. I think even the same. Tumah in the house, if there's tumah in the house by the, right, anything by the window is tahor. Tumah keneged aruba, right, if there's tumah, ein ba'aruba potech tefach, tumah b'bayit keneged aruba tahor. If there's something in the house next to the aruba, that will be pure, right? Because again, there's tumah in the house, it won't get to near the window. And tumah keneged babayit keneged aruba tahor. Tumah keneged aruba. One second, did I just read that by accident twice? Kol babayit kulo tahor. Ain't right. I read that already twice. Sorry. Let's just start again. Ein ba'aruba potech tefach. If it has less than a tefach, still tumah babayit keneged aruba tahor. Tumah keneged aruba kol babayit kulo tahor. Again, if the tumah itself is where that little opening is, even though it's such a small opening, we still view it as if the tumah goes out the opening and there's no law of ohel. So it really doesn't matter if it's potech tefach or not potech tefach. It really makes no difference. V'idach, okay, so now where does this get you? This shows you that there's no lavud by, right? What does this show you? In the middle. Because if lavud worked, this is a tefach, forget about less than three tvachim, right? Either which way we view this as if, right? We don't view this as if it's closed. If we viewed it as if it was closed, then it would be ohel fully. But we say that we view this skylight as if it's open, even though it's such a small opening and lavud would basically seal that off. There you see lavud doesn't work in the middle of a room. Next case. V'idach. So now what's the reaction of the other opinion going to be to this? Oh, he'll say, just like in the first case with the Eruvin, the other person said, oh, Eruvin isn't the same as Sukkah. Likewise here, Shani Hilchot Tum'ah, Dehachi Gemir Alhu. These traditions about impurity were passed down by tradition. Therefore, it's not indicative of anything else. It's unique halachot for tumah, for impurity. Can't learn from there to our issue of sukkah. Darash Rabbi Yehuda bar Ila, bayit shenifchat v'sikech al gabav kshera. Okay, so now, no pictures right now. Let's move back to the Gemara. If you have a house that, again, ended up with the space, we had a hole in the middle of our roof, and then you put schach on top, kshera, amar lefanav, Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Peresh, says, there's something that doesn't make sense about this. Okay, please explain yourself. What kind of case could this be and how could this work? Okay, and basically, we already explained it the way we're going to explain it now, but right now he's saying something about this doesn't make sense. So he says, Kach Peresh Abba, Arba Amok Psula, Pachot Me Arba Amok Kshera. He basically says, you have to qualify your statement. Your statement is not clear enough. Your statement should be qualified, and it should say, it really depends. It's only going to be kosher if there's less than 4 cubits from the schach that you put inside this roof, right? And you have a house, the roof, the middle of it caves in, you fill it in with schach. It's only going to work if there's less than 4 cubits away from the wall. If there's more than 4 cubits, it won't work. So he basically says, it's very nicely, Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli, you said this halacha, but you didn't qualify it, and it needed qualification. Likewise with our next case, Darash Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli. Again, Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli says a statement, Avlumi sharia. Okay, avlumi is a small fish. This type, okay, so now we're on a different topic. It's just a similar structure of statement that he made and need for qualification. Amar lefanav Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, Rebbe Peresh, you have to explain yourself better. Kach amar Abba, my father said, Shoma kamploni asura, Shoma kamploni muteret. Okay, this is a type of fish that's a kosher fish. What's the problem? It's often caught in a net with non-kosher fish. So he said, it depends where you live. In certain places, there's more likelihood of there being non-kosher fish mixed in with this one, and people will confuse and end up eating non-kosher fish. In certain places, there's no concern of that. Depends where. Okay, now we're going to learn what are the different places and why is this right? Why is it different in different places? We said depending on where you live, that will affect whether you can eat this small fish and not have to worry about other non-kosher fish being mixed in. Just like Abai says, tzachanta de Bav, the tzachanta type of fish that they found in the city of Bav, in the Nahar of Bav, de Bav Nahara, in the river of the Bav, that was the name of it, Sharia is permitted, my time. What's the reason? Ilema, now the issue is that we're assuming for whatever reason, there aren't non-kosher fish in that stream, or not very many. What's the reason there aren't non-kosher fish? If you say it's because there's a strong current in that water and the non-kosher fish can't make it in that kind of water. Now we're going to see why you would think that. Because non-kosher fish don't have a spine, and therefore, they can't survive in fish without strong currents. Now, if you're starting to wonder, does that make any sense? Well, the Gemara says, but that's not true. But we do see fish like that in waters with strong currents. So that can't be it. See that they exist there. So next option. Maybe because the water is very salty. Because it doesn't have scales, it can't survive in salt water. But also that doesn't work. Say it's a pun, doesn't hold water because we see that they do survive in salt water. It must be there's not enough mud in this water. Okay, and they claim, okay, well, what's the deal with the mud? Okay, so here's a few different interpretations of what the issue with the mud is. Rashi says, "Ein tichaloto nahal magdil umashkin shvatzim umashkitz shkatzim urimasim." They often have this approach that certain creatures are, They reproduce from dirt. That there's forgot the word for it, but this spontaneous reproduction, that it comes from the dirt. And here, since this dirt there's not enough of this mud in this water, it doesn't allow for the reproduction. Others say, no, it's the fish themselves reproduce. It's not that they thought that it comes from the dirt, but that without the dirt, it's not an environment that's ripe for reproduction. Okay. And therefore these type of fish don't reproduce. And it's for specifically those kind of fish. They won't reproduce in this kind of water. And that must be the reason. Okay. Amar Ravina. So again, how did we get here? Because we brought this statement of Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli, who talked about our case in the Mishnah. Now, our Mishnah had already qualified it, that it has to be within 4 cubits of the wall. But Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli didn't qualify his statement. He came Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi and said, hey, you forgot to qualify your statement, qualify it. And then he said the exact same thing by this dog tamei. Really depends where you live, by this small fish, that we're worried if you have the small fish, it might mix in with other fish, and people, because they're small, people might confuse them and eat the non-kosher fish, but that's only a problem in certain places, depending on the water, how much mud there is in the water, that will indicate whether there will be a likelihood of non-kosher fish being there or not. Okay, back to our topic. Amar Ravina, oh no, we're not yet back to our topic. One more thing here. Nowadays, now that there's these 2 other rivers that dump into that river, Asira, it's actually now forbidden because now there's more likelihood, since this became, what they did was they built some canal which brought other waters to this body of water, which now there's all sorts of other fish that come in, and that obviously changed the environment, and now you have to be concerned for these non-kosher fish as well. Itma. Now we have another case. Here comes our picture. Okay, we have a case that we mentioned in the Mishnah about this achsadra, if you remember. So the achsadra was this case where you had a U-shaped house, then you have a U-shaped portico, right, with kind of a roof like a pergola, and then in between there's that little, right, it's also U-shaped, and then there's this square or rectangle in the middle of it, and you want to put your schach there. So now if you see already in the picture, in picture 117, it looks a little different because before we said in the Mishnah, as long as the portico is not 4 cubits wide, then we view the schach as being connected to the house, the walls of the house, and it uses the walls of the house as its walls from the laws of Dofen Akuma. But now we're going to see Itma. If you put schach on the achsadra and the achsadra, okay, before we talked about the walls being all the way at the house, not near the schach. But if where the schach borders on the portico, you put down these beams, and the beams are not wide enough, but there's less than 3 handbreadths between each beam, then we view those beams as a continuum, as if it's a wall because of laws of Lavud, and they all join together, and that works. Kshera. But psimin are these beams, standing beams. Okay, you can see them in the picture here if you're looking at the picture. So you basically, on those 3 walls, you put beams every few, right, every less than 3 cubits, and you've basically created a wall, fictitious wall, because it's not a full wall, but it's enough of a halachic wall because of Lavud. She'ein la psimim, but if you didn't put those psimim down, Abai amar kshera, the Rav amar psula. Now the assumption is we're already more than 4 cubits away from the wall, so you can't use the walls of the house. But if it doesn't have psimim, okay, now the next picture, 118, is going to show why some people think that it works. Abai amar kshera, Rav amar psula. So we have this debate. Abai says it works, Rav says it doesn't. Abai amar kshera, why? Amrina pitikra yoreh v'sotem. You might remember this from Eruvin, and we're going to quote soon the case we quoted there, which is we view, since you have this barrier between the achsadra and the schach, we view the wall, the edges of the achsadra, as if they come down and we have imaginary walls. So it's fascinating. According to this, you could have a sukkah without walls at all, okay? Because your walls of the house don't work, but you've dropped down these imaginary walls where the borders of the achsadra, the portico, are, and you drop them down. Okay. Rav amar psula lo amrina pitikra yoreh v'sotem. You can't say we view these. What do you mean? There's no walls here. You can't just say, oh, well, there's a barrier here. There's this clear distinction between the 2 parts, the schach and the portico. So, let's just drop an imaginary wall. What are you talking about? There's no walls in the sukkah. So now, Amarle Rava labai. Rava says to Abai, L'didach da'amart pitikra yoreh v'sotem. According to you, you want to say pitikra yoreh v'sotem. I have a question for you. Afilu hifchit dofen emtzai. Are you going to say even if you, if, right, the middle, 1 second, afilu hifchit dofen emtzai, that's picture 119. Okay, let's say you have these, 1 second, even you have a sukkah with 3 walls, which is in a courtyard, right? And then you have these, 1 second, right. Oh, sorry. He's talking very simply right now, I remember. Let's say, okay, I couldn't tell from the picture. It's hard to see the way they draw the picture here. What if you took away a 3rd wall of a sukkah? According to you, if you have a sukkah with 2 walls only, now what do we know? We know that a sukkah needs minimum of 3 walls. But if you say pitikra yoreh v'sotem, then basically if you have a sukkah with 2 walls and schach at the top, let's say that the edges of the schach come down and create these imaginary walls. So theoretically, a 2-walled sukkah should be totally fine. So how can you say the pitikra yoreh v'sotem, you don't need any walls here in this portico case. In that case, a two-walled sukkah should be totally fine because you can always just say the edges of the schach, which are clearly demarcated as a border, can come down imaginarily and draw two more walls and you're set. And of course, we don't say that because we all know we don't say that. So what does Abaye say? Amarle Abaye, Amarle. Abaye says, Modina lecha bahahi dehavele kimavoya mefulash. Says, I agree with you that two-sided, two-walled sukkah, two walls opposite each other, right? He's assuming the two walls are opposite each other. He said that clearly doesn't work because that's like an open, it's a mefulash. It's open on both sides. A sukkah has to be something that has walls, protects you. There's no protection here. Now, if you go back to our case of the portico, it also doesn't really have protection because there's no walls at all. However, it's situated in a U-shaped house formation. So while it's true, we said before, it doesn't have any walls, it does have these outer walls, and it's not something that's totally open to the elements. So because of the outer walls of the house, even though halachically they're not walls, they prevent our sukkah from being what we call mefulash. Remember, mefulash is a term we had in Mavli. Mavoy mefulash is before we talked about an alley, and I said it has three walls. And mavoy mefulash is one that only has two walls parallel to each other, and it's totally open on both sides to the public domain. That's something that's, considered very open. This also is considered very open, this two-walled sukkah. So pitikra yoreh v'sotem doesn't help us when it's fully open on both sides and people could go right through it. Then it's not really a sukkah. But since this is in your courtyard, which is in your portico, which is in your house, and there's these outer walls, that keeps it from being considered mefulash. And that's how Abaye distinguishes between the two cases. Now they're going to suggest, Lema Abaye v'Rava v'plukta de Rav u'Shmuel kamifugim. Why don't we say that they're having the exact same machloket that Rav and Shmuel had? And again, we're going to remind us of a sugya we saw in Eruvin. Achsadra bebik'ah. What if you have a portico, not outside your courtyard where it had these walls around it, but you have an achsadra in a valley. So there's nothing around it, but you put up 4 beams and a roof on top, picture number 120. There's a machloket, Rav Amar mutar letaltel bekulo. You can carry in this whole space, even though it doesn't really have walls normally to allow carrying within a space. To say this is a private domain within a public domain, it needs walls. So Rav says you can carry in this whole thing. We say we view the walls as if they go down. You can only carry in this space 4 cubits. It's as if it's in the public domain because, right? Because you can't say pitikra yoreh v'sotem here. So now, why don't we suggest that the machloket between Abaye and Rava about whether we say pitikra yoreh v'sotem in the achsadra inside our courtyard is the same machloket as Rav and Shmuel have? Do we say pitikra, which Abaye says yes and Rav says yes, or do we not like Shmuel? Shmuel will match our opinion before of Rava. We'll stop here for today and figure out tomorrow's shiur. Is this really the same machloket, or is there a reason to distinguish between the case of the achsadra, the portico, outside in the middle of nowhere, when it comes to eruvin or when it comes to carrying, versus the sugya by us about whether it can be used for your sukkah and whether pitikra yoreh v'sotem works in a sukkah in this particular case or not? So you'll have to wait for tomorrow to get the answer. Have a great day, everyone.